All right. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, good everyone, wherever you're joining us today or whenever you're viewing this back. Welcome to NFCP's Global Sanctions Update for November. As you're probably already aware, my name is Louis Vargas, the founder of NFCP, and I'm thrilled to be here with all of you, and especially our incredible panelists who are joining us to help make sense of the latest developments and sanctions from the EU, UK, and the US, with a special focus on the Nordics. And this is one of those topics that can feel overwhelming, but trust me, by the end of the session, you'll walk away with clarity, insights, and maybe even a few aha moments. First, let's set the stage. Over the past month, we've seen some major moves in the sanction space, new packages, stricter enforcement, and even some surprises. Whether you're a compliance officer, a legal expert, or just someone trying to keep up with the ever-changing regulatory landscape, this conversation is for you. We're here to break it all down in a way that's practical, actionable, and dare I say, even a little engaging. Joining me today are some of the sharpest minds in the field. As always, Ian Bolton from Sanctions SOS, who will be helping us unpack the EU's latest sanctions packages and any other updates. And he seems necessary for us in the compliance field and for businesses out there. Also, a familiar face to the room, Mark Handley from Duane Morris, who will give us the lowdown on the UK's uh, sanctions updates and also the enforcement actions around the world. And we have a newcomer, Tyler Nielsen. Thank you for joining us and he's from Sanctions Advisory, and he will be giving us insights from the US and OFAC perspective and landscape and its effect on the global markets and compliance landscapes. And finally, Aleksi Pursiainen from Solid Plan Consulting, who will be giving us that Nordic perspective and Nordic feel that we are always accustomed to. So before we dive in, we want to hear from you, the audience. So if you have, so if anytime, I'm sorry. So if we have time at the end, as I mentioned before, we'll open up for questions. If not, please send your questions to us at info@nfcp.info, and we'll be sure to share them with our panelists afterwards. Uh, Please avoid, and this is just a disclaimer, please avoid from asking specific questions about any customers or clients, as those should be directed to your internal compliance and legal teams. Okay, so with all that out of the way, let's get started. Ian, I'm going to kick things off with you. So from the EU perspective, what are the headlines here and why should businesses be paying attention?
Um, so, uh, Give me 1 second, because normally I would do the UK, and and I think
Ah, sorry.
Mark
That's my
normally do
fault.
the
No, no,
EU.
no.
So I'm hoping that's
That's
right. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
Ian,
That's my mistake. I flipped things around. So bad on me. Ian, you have the UK, and as you rightly pointed out, Mark, you have the EU. So my fault with the introductions there.
Not that I don't know what's going on in the EU, but just that I feel a little underprepared
No,
to
no, no. It's my
to weigh
fault.
in. That's all good. So it's been an interesting month in the UK. I will avoid going into too much detail on the enforcement side because obviously Mark will touch on that. But we've had some action there. But we've seen some sort of relatively slow sort of month for designations and things. We've seen some action on domestic terrorism listings in the UK. But the big ones have really been around Russia again. So we've seen some major changes in the Russia sanctions environment, in terms of from an LNG perspective, denial of maritime services to Russian LNG carriers, etc. And industry, and then obviously we had the Rosneft Lukoil, and the UK was actually the first to move on that, and then the EU and US did afterwards. And obviously that's a substantial change in the overall position. We've seen the oil price cap brought down by both the UK and the EU, but this then obviously completely blows that out of the water to all intents and purposes, because you've essentially got the two biggest producers now designated and out of the loop for global oil moves. So yeah, so that was a big move. We've also had a general license around that in terms of wind down notices and a sort of an acceptance that certain overseas assets will have to be sold off, and there'll have to be some sort of allowance for that. Beyond that, we've had a national crime agency red alert on sort of sanctions evasion techniques around the maritime space, and we've had new maritime evasion guidance published by OFSI and the Department for Transport, which is a really useful document and good piece of sort of update on previous maritime guidance. That kind of feels like it, which we've had a few bits and pieces in terms of the odd designations here and there. So we've had some around, for example, the Iran regime, obviously with the snapback, all of that kind of triggered in a significant way. But we've not had huge numbers, I would say, on average over the last month. It feels a little quiet. Whether that's just as sort of Parliament in the UK is ramping back up again. There've been some massive changes as well in the way civil service is being structured in the UK. So most departments are being asked to make sort of 20 to 25% redundancies, and I'm sure that's probably having an impact on their ability to keep things ticking over. But yeah, so that's from a UK perspective. It feels a little on the quiet side. I'll leave Mark to jump in on the enforcement side, but yeah, like, I don't know. I feel like I'm sure there will be a dam breaking moment in a week or two, and suddenly we'll be flooded again.
It's a scary prospect that what you've just gone through counts as a quiet month. I mean, that's gosh. Yeah, I'm not sure I would say that's a quiet month, but okay.
Yeah, I guess with all the dynamicism that we face in sanctions, yeah, comparatively it's quiet, but still quite crazy. And you mentioned the Parliament's ramping back up, which seems kind of weird to hear because it's middle of November and holidays are quickly approaching in December. So maybe we'll get a lot of designations right before the holidays, which will be a nice or tough Christmas gift from the UK government.
Yeah, absolutely. We have this weird situation in the UK where they come back from summer recess in Parliament, and they're back for like a couple of weeks, and then they go on conference recess, and which basically takes out the whole of like the latter part of September, the beginning part of October, and then it's sort of like, right, and you've got now like a month and a half before Christmas to get everything done. So yeah, it's always interesting.
Oh boy. And it's interesting to hear about the redundancies. I mean, I wonder how that's going to shake out and how it might hamper those efforts, as you mentioned, both in the kind of, designation side, but also on the enforcement side.
Yeah, absolutely. It's I don't know whether it's every element within each department, within each government department, is going to be finding that, but I imagine it's going to have to be. And sanctions is obviously quite a technical area anyway. So I know that there's a degree of struggle to recruit people in because people sort of have a tendency to want to avoid getting into the rabbit warren that we've all got into. It's fun nature, right? Like,
right.
So, yeah.
I mean, quite honestly, I think a lot has to also do with the compensation, because it's quite low, as civil servants always are quite low. And now, I mean, in the US, at least they claim that, the kind of health care packages they give you and subsidize, it's good. But in the UK, you don't have to worry about that. You have national health care. So I don't know what then is the kind of pitch to help people take a pay cut to join them, but I guess we'll see. All right, thank you for that, Ian. And again, apologize to everyone for mislabeling the updates. But now, Mark, over to you with the EU update.
Yeah, thanks, Louis. I'm not sure what UK enforcement Ian's referring to. I can see tumbleweed rolling past, but there was back in September there was Ofsted imposed a fine for I think it was 170,000, 150,000, something like that. There hasn't been anything since then. They have published their annual report, which gives sort of total numbers of investigations they've had ongoing over the year. And the UK government has helpfully created a new sort of enforcement page that has in one place all the old information, nothing new, of enforcement actions taken by HMRC and Ofsted and the National Crime Agency. So at least there's a one-stop shop for getting information, even if there's no new developments. The EU, you've got 27 countries, so chances are you're going to have more activity on the enforcement side. You've got investigations newly launched in places like Czechia and Norway, Estonia and Germany being very, very busy. There was the case was actually from last year, but I only came across it a few weeks ago. 3 convictions in Germany for exporting 500 luxury cars. The 3 individuals are given sentences of 6 years, 6 years, and 4 years, and the 30 million in gross revenue obtained from the exports was entirely confiscated, which makes it the biggest fine or penalty or confiscation in the EU last year, and I think the largest ever in Germany. And there was another conviction in Germany for 4 years and 11 months worth of jail time. So it's nearly a century of jail time imposed in Europe last year and this year. That most of that is Germany and Estonia, with a little bit of the Netherlands. Lots of member states where you don't see, it's just not made public, so you don't know. Other enforcement, I was told, sort of semi off the record, that the German sanctions authorities have had 3,000 investigations each of last year and this year ongoing. So that's a vast workload of investigations that are ongoing in Germany. So yeah, there's certainly enforcement going on where it's made public. Obviously, we had the 19th package. I think a lot of the people on this call will already know at least a little bit about the 19th package. LNG certainly got a lot of press. More shadow fleet vessels designated. There was a big targeting of crypto and crypto exchanges, and a particular stable coin that was being used for circumvention that the regulations have gone after. A slew of Russian banks added to the transaction ban list, and more additions to the prohibited trade annexes in Regulation 833, and a bunch of new designations under Regulation 269, especially, or most prominently perhaps, China, India, and Thailand, especially involved in the oil trade. The most interesting change from my perspective that came with the 19th package, some people may see as not a change at all, but I think it's a very big change, which is the introduction into a piece of legislation of a definition of ownership and control. The EU hadn't had that in any legislation at all. It was left to the courts to interpret what ownership and control means. There was a definition in the EU best practices note, but that document never had any legal force. But that definition has now been taken from the EU best practices note and put into Regulation 269. And so it's now binding law, and that does provide helpful clarity. But I think it is a big change from where the courts had got to, especially the Court of Justice, on what ownership and control means. Perhaps most famously or infamously, from my perspective, the decision in Hanseatic Trust and Trade had said ownership and control means something different in sanctions law than it does in company law. And you've now got the EU regulation taking very much company law based criteria as the meaning of ownership and control. You could have the Court of Justice in, I think it's Millibank, deciding that one common director and a common registered address was enough for control. And that's just not going to be possible now under the changed definition. There was a German decision that came out this week on an asset freeze in relation to a Russian post office entity in Germany, and a really interesting decision analysis of what ownership control means or used to mean. Finding that the 9 designated directors of this Russian entity who have no ownership interest control the entity for the purposes of EU sanctions. I don't think the court could reach that decision now with the amended regulation. Similarly, there was a Swedish decision last year that in relation to cyber that it held it was owned and controlled by sanctioned individuals. Finding that control could be identified where there was the opportunity to exercise control. So quite nebulous, quite close to what the UK has introduced post-Brexit. And again, those sorts of slightly blurry-edged definitions of ownership and control are gone now, which provides helpful clarity, but it's a slightly odd move for the EU to take at this stage. And 4 years in, there's nothing that deals with ownership under trusts or beneficial ownership. It's sort of direct ownership of proprietary rights for the purposes of ownership, and that's a slightly odd direction for the EU to be moving into. So, as I say, some people may see it as no change at all because it's taking the definition from the best practices document and cutting and pasted into the regulation, but I think it's quite a big change. But slightly stayed under the radar in terms of a lot of the press reporting and law firm alerts on the 19th package.
Yeah, I think that's going to be a bit of a nightmare for compliance officers, right? Because we've been operating in a slightly different way based on, you said, previous guidance, even though that wasn't really best practices from the EU. But we all know that control is a fuzzy thing to kind of monitor. And I think we kind of came up with a science around it. But with this now law in place, I think that that would make things a bit trickier.
Yeah.
And I guess something to
or
quickly,
easier. I mean, it is helpful to have
Mhm.
an actual definition that has legal force. You can't really complain too much about that.
Right. I mean, it's something to point to, but I think now if if you're a bank and you make the claim that based on your feeling of control, then when it goes to if it goes to court, then they're going to point to that, this more defined way of looking at it, and then the banks have to backtrack. So, or the other companies would have to backtrack. So I think that will present the tricky nature around it. Like you said, we can't we can't be too upset. Now we have something clear, but I think it'll take some time to wrap our heads around it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Cool. And one more thing I like to kind of highlight from the European side, it's not strictly sanctions related, but the EBA used to have a legal mandate, or I mean, I guess still does have a legal mandate to contribute to preventing the use of financial systems for the purpose of money laundering and terrorist financing, and I guess in a way sanctions. But as of the end of the year, they'll be transferring this mandate to AMLA. And so, the EBA will continue to be responsible for financial crime within, I believe, the insurance space, and they will cooperate with AMLA. But I've already started seeing people moving over from the EBA to AMLA. So I think that's also interesting now development. People who used to focus on that on the EBA side now making their way over to AMLA to perform similar tasks. Yeah. So just wanted to quickly mention that. Yeah. So thank you very much, Ian. Really appreciate it as always. And Tyler, over to you for our US update.
Yeah, thanks. So even amidst the US government shutdown, there has been quite a bit that's happened, which the shutdown might be ending, and but from a external point of view, you'd only really notice it if you were trying to get something out of Treasury or Commerce, right? Trying to get a new license or the like. And that's mostly because back when I was at Treasury in 2013, right, Treasury had said, yeah, we're not doing this like government shutdown thing anymore. We know these are going to happen more in the future. So everyone's essential, show up even if you don't get paid. And that's certainly continued. So when it comes to thinking about the US, I have 4 buckets of stuff to, kind of compartmentalize what's been happening. So we've had some big policy moves. We've had some noteworthy developments in terms of what it means from the administration. There's been some very much business as usual designations. So that's been the transnational organized crime, Hezbollah, financiers, Haiti terrorism, right? We won't focus so much on that, right? Those are just kind of your run-of-the-mill designations under existing authorities. And then there's the big thing in the future in terms of IEPA and what does it mean with the Supreme Court. So, right, we're going to focus first on the big policy changes, right? I think the one that we all took note of was Rosneft and Lukoil. And right, as Ian and Mark noted, right, it comes in conjunction with UK and EU actions, right? And this has completely changed how to think and approach dealing with Russian crude, because now we have full US designations in place. There's been the 30-day wind down GLs. There's the authorization to deal with Rosneft's German subsidiary, right? All very much in line with what the UK and the EU have done, right? And I think that's the most noteworthy policy point of it is, for the first time under this administration, we have a coordinated action on Russia to restrict Russia's operating space, right, when it comes to their largest revenue generator. I don't think we should read more into it than that this was an event that happened, right? We shouldn't be trying to read tea leaves and applying this lesson and say, okay, there's now a new direction for the Trump administration, right? Their policies change and float based upon, personal wins and go in kind of 2-week cycles. So now that we're almost 2 weeks on, or more than 2 weeks on from that designation, we could completely be in a new cycle. And that's where we are in a bit of a new cycle because now the focus, right, most recently has been on Syria. Right, we had the UN delistings that the US pushed on Shara and other Syrian associates. That continued with, the first White House visit of a Syrian head of state. Very kind of remarkable that the first one to visit is a, former Al-Qaeda designated terrorist. But that also just speaks to where we are in the sanctions landscape. There was a tri-seal guidance issued. So this is from Treasury, State, and Commerce, highlighting here's the new rules for what you can do with Syria. The short of it is, with these delistings and the continued pause of the Caesar Act sanctions, many things are now permitted with Syria that were permitted under the general licenses in the last policy, but now we just have further clarity in terms of the government of Syria now being not subject to sanctions. There are still export control requirements for anything on the Commerce Control List, the CCL list, but if it's EAR 99, then it can go to Syria now, right? Which is a big change, but that doesn't. Right. It basically doesn't mean that everything is fully open. You still got to do checks of and classifications of those items to see, okay, can we take advantage of these new rules or not? But from a U.S. policy point of view, the Syria is now open for business, open for reconstruction. The third kind of big item to really pay attention to is this again whipsaw change of the BIS affiliates rule. So AKA, this is 50% rule that mirrored what the OFAC rule that we all know and familiar with in terms of applying those export controls to subsidiaries, right? This was announced to go into effect by the end of October, but now has been paused as a result of the latest détente reached between the US and China on all things trade, right? China has removed their export controls on a lot of rare earth items, though they still have plenty that exist as well, right? And in response, the US has now paused for a year, at least, the BIS affiliates rule. So, right, what does this really mean? It means, yes, it's not enforced, but, right, it's a policy decision. It's a rule that can be changed or amended at any time. And the way the rule is written now is in a year, if no one does anything, then the affiliates rule automatically comes back in place. So, right, the new status quo is we have at most a year pause, right, for needing to do these checks. But there's still very much a policy appetite for applying export controls to subsidiaries of listed parties. And as with with this administration, anything can change at a moment's notice. So we could have this rule removed and be right back there, and it all depends on the political negotiations. So I think those are the key three takeaways of the last month is the Russia designation. Right, let's take it for what it is. Syria, we have a greater opening, and now we have, this BIS affiliates rule, aka the 50% rule, paused. Right. In other interesting developments, has really been kind of much more of the, the President Trump's personal politics. So we have the designation of the President of Colombia as a, facilitator of narco trafficking. Right. This is very much, though, a personal, attacking those that, have slighted the administration. Right. It's very rare to see a designation of a head of state. I mean, I remember when I was at Treasury kind of ranking our hands of do we designate actual stated enemies of the United States? Right. And the complications of it. But clearly, that's out the window when it comes to kind of trying to bully and pick on the smaller states that are much more dependent on ties to the US. Right. So we have Colombia presidential designation. We also have Belarus removals of sanctions, particularly Belavia now being removed. Right. They did have a general license before to allow activity, but the removal kind of settles it and makes it clear that Belavia isn't subject to sanctions. This is all part of the long-going discussions between the U.S. and the Lukashenko regime to have political prisoners released in exchange for sanctions relief. And then we've also had Balkans, the Republika Srpska designations that happened late under the Biden administration. Right, those have now been removed again as part of it's really been kind of right-wing personalities in the U.S. calling for these removals, and then now the administration taking the action to remove those Balkan sanctions. So I think the real takeaway from kind of the very personal minutia politics at play and the bigger picture policy points of view is that the administration is going to use sanctions as they see fit in the best way that they see fit, and that is really going to continue to apply. To read bigger sweeping policy agendas beyond kind of that motivation of what is best for the administration at this time, I think would be kind of missing the point. It is very much transactional and in the moment, and things can and will change kind of week to week. And that's where it takes me to kind of the big thing to really watch for is the use of IEEPA and tariffs. So last week, the Supreme Court heard oral arguments on can sweeping tariffs be applied under IEEPA. This was the administration's appeal to the highest court after they lost, in successive lower court rulings that said, no, you can't use IEEPA in this way. The kind of immediate readout based upon what the justices said in their comments was, okay, it's going to be a tough sell for the administration to get the go ahead from the Supreme Court to be able to use IEEPA in this way, but I would say, right, let's not count our chickens before they hatch. The Supreme Court has been very surprising thus far this year, and right, very well could continue to surprise. And right, the main takeaway is, right, even if they rule that the administration can't use IEEPA, there are other tariff authorities. We are going to be living with tariffs as a reality of this administration, right? The difference is those laws that allow tariffs to be imposed require more administration and notice, and right, they're capped and limited, right? Assuming we're going to follow the letter of how those statutes were written, which creates an interesting dynamic of what is then the future use of this administration of sanctions. If they can't use tariffs, right, kind of as they see fit, well then, right, I would expect to see much more sanctions being used, sanctions applied, removed, right, based upon kind of the political whims of the administration, right, which we've seen a bit recently from, right, the Colombian designations, the Belarus removals, Balkans removals. So yeah, that's those have been my top takeaways, right, in between changing diapers for the past couple weeks. But yeah, I think that's a pretty much takes us up to speed on what the US does during the longest running government shutdown.
Thank you for that, Tyler. I guess one thing that is interesting is also how, the US is now seemingly tightening the screws on Venezuela and finding new ways to do that, right? So, they're saying now that they're trafficking narcotics, and so they're looking for many ways to kind of show that Venezuela is a bad actor. And it started with sanctions, and that seems to be working to a certain extent, but now they're looking for new ways to tighten the screws. And yeah, it's just interesting now to, see this kind of shift to now apply, like, I guess, more legal barriers for the Venezuelan government.
Yeah, well, and I mean,
Mhm.
we're going like the administration's going way beyond legal barriers. I mean, with the attacking of speedboats without
Right.
any clear legal authority, but also,
Mhm.
right, there's now more than 10% of all US Navy assets are positioned in and around Venezuela in the Caribbean, right? We
Oh.
just had an aircraft carrier group move from the Mediterranean over to Venezuela,
Mm.
right? These things are not done lightly, and right, it's a big policy question in the US of, well, what are we really trying to do? Right, or what is the administration trying to do? And at least it's pressure and intimidate. That's pretty clear.
Mhm.
But are we going to see actual armed conflict? It shouldn't be ruled out because
Mm.
it's a pretty substantial buildup. Right, and that's also, as I always right say, it's like, you know, right, if war is politics by other means, right, sanctions is politics short of war.
Right.
Right, which we all can relate to in that regard. But in this case, for Venezuela, it seems like we could definitely be
Mm.
heading that way.
Interesting. Yeah, thanks again for that, Tyler. And now moving on to Aleksi to give us a spotlight on the Nordics.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks, guys, for the wonderful broader picture. My few points are quite lesser in significance, but I think the biggest development in Nordics, or at least here where I'm looking at things in Helsinki, has been the implications of the UK and US sanctions on Lukoil. We have in Finland maybe a fifth of the Finnish retail petrol distribution service station market is maybe a fifth of that belongs to a company called Teboil, which is an indirectly fully owned subsidiary of Lukoil. So there's been quite a bit of both public interest and then obviously compliance-related concerns across both the financial and other industries here. Almost immediately on, I think it was October 15th, when the UK announced its sanctions, the largest supplier of petrol in Finland, announced that they would close supplies to Teboil. And then when the U.S. sanctions were announced, maybe a week later, everybody else sort of took notice as well. And it's been a little bit chaotic. I mean, we do have, as mentioned, we have both from the US and the UK wind down licenses for a brief period. And then OFAC also published a general license specifically addressing the non-Russian retail service station operations of Lukoil. But there's been quite a bit of confusion. Many companies in Finland with limited previous exposure to U.S. sanctions had a steep learning curve in trying to understand what it meant. And there are conditions and restrictions in the license itself, which has made it not easily compliable in all instances. So currently, and there's a further complication is caused by the fact that while the petrol distribution business is essentially run by Teboil and ultimately by Lukoil, the service stations themselves are actually run by independent, franchising type entrepreneurs through their own companies, which is then added a further layer of complexity, and it is starting to look not very good for that chain. We had the brief glimmer of call it hope or something else depending on your viewpoint of a possible sales of the non-Russian operations of Lukoil to Gunvor, a ostensibly Swedish and well, let's say ostensibly non-Russian energy giant with reportedly connections still to Russia, which was quickly then denounced by OFAC as a non-viable buyer for the non-Russian operations of Lukoil. The wind down and retail service licenses are running down. I think they close on the 21st of November, and even now during their existence and their validity, it seems that the operations of the chain are getting close to being impossible. There's been some talk of in addition to a potential buyer being found to either the whole non-Russian Lukoil operations or potentially just the Finnish service station chain, which currently doesn't look like happening in any time window. That would be enough to save what is savable. There's also been some media suggestions about the potential sort of government intervention in the model of what was done with Rosneft refineries in Germany and with smaller entities in certain other countries. The Finnish legislation is ill-equipped to handle that type of situation. My sort of initial guess is that there might be something that the government might possibly be authorized to do in the case where the demise of the whole chain would have like a critical impact on Finnish society, which doesn't look likely. Although there are areas in Finland that are likely to suffer should the chain go under. But in any case, so that's been what I've been doing for the past 3 weeks. Mainly here. I think the biggest takeaway from that, rather than this war story, is the vastly varying level of preparedness of Finnish companies to face this situation. I mean, it really cannot have taken anybody following, political global developments in the past few years as a surprise that Lukoil ultimately ended up being sanctioned by Western powers, and everybody who was taken by surprise and hadn't prepared to the fact that they have major dealings with Teboil in Finland and had done no homework as to what are we going to do if that happens, I'm very happy to support them and send my invoices, but it is something that I think a number of companies hopefully will take as a lesson learned to try and prepare for these potential major developments. And I'm not saying I've faced companies in Finland, both in industry and banks, that have been very well prepared and have a playbook ready from day one, and hats off to them. But for us others, a lesson to be learned. And then one more minor point from the sort of supervision side, we have an online store chain, electronics, home goods, whatever, sold by a company called Verkkokauppa.com, a very large chain from where I buy most of my electronics as well. Has been handed down €500,000 fine for deficiencies in their AML systems. So as an online store, obviously they are not an obliged entity in general, but for transactions that involve payments in cash in excess of €10,000, those transactions are subject to the AML Act. And essentially they had, I'm sorry if there's, maybe I shouldn't say this aloud, but yeah, the situation wasn't great. The main point I think from them was that there was a serious deficiencies in their risk assessment, so they hadn't really accepted that there are AML related risks involved in even major cash transactions. I think the biggest single or potential more likely a set of connected cash transactions was €800,000. That buys you a whole hell of a lot of iPhones, man. So it was not insignificant at the level of that. So, and they had a lot of then concerns on for instance checking of beneficial owners and all that. But the reason why I raised this in this call, the supervision visit was done in late 2023, just 6 months after the Finnish Parliament had added into our AML Act a specific provision that requires companies subject to AML obligations to establish effective policies and procedures and controls to comply with EU sanctions. So that was enforced when the supervision visit was done, and it was not great for Verkkokauppa.com. What supervisor found out was that they did apparently do some sanction screening checks, but only after the transaction had been completed. So the customer came in, paid in cash, got the stuff, went away, and then they checked whether or not that was unlawful or not. And this was unsatisfactory. The store, I mean, I have some sympathy because it was very shortly after the changes in the legislation, all that. So hopefully I'm not being overly critical. But any case, they said then in their defense, they said that, well, there were no actual matches, so looking back at the day that there were no violations, but the supervisor said that the point of the additions to the AML Act was specifically to impose the obligation to implement the procedures, not just to comply with what the sanctions regulations said. And then they, as a last sort of grasp, last Hail Mary, they said that also they are of the opinion that EU sanctions regulations are so complicated that it is difficult to understand what they sort of require, and because the supervisor for these types of entities hadn't released their own guidance as to what the EU sanctions mean, that they were ill-equipped to understand what's required of them. But this was not met with sympathy by the supervisor either. So that's what's been going on in Helsinki. Sorry to be so Helsinki focused, even if I was tasked with covering the whole of Nordics. But thanks for your attention. Cheers.
Well, thank you for that, Aleksi. And I think, sticking with the FinFSA, my understanding is that soon, maybe in the next few days or maybe a couple of weeks, they are planning to release a report of their on-site inspection of Nordea. So it'll be interesting to hear what comes out of that. I don't know, obviously, because I'm not privy to that, but that might be some something to cover in our next update.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the industry, financial industry here is for sure looking forward to reading that, because it is the first sort of major. The case that I was referring to was a supervisory act by the sort of regional administrative body or whatever that supervises, smaller non-financial entities. So this is the first FinFSA really big action on this. So the report will certainly be read with considerable interest around these corners.
Awesome. Thanks again, Aleksi, for your update. Okay, so at this point, is there anybody on the call who has any questions for our panelists? If so, you could raise your hand or just unmute yourself and ask the question. Okay, it looks like for now, people are very... Oh, we have a question from one of our panelists. Ian, go for it.
I figured as no one else is asking any questions, I'm just interested in, I guess, the panel's perspectives on the control issue, to come back to that point that Mark mentioned. Like, because to me it seems like obviously there are some real risks in terms of there's now a potential sort of discrepancy between exactly how the EU does it versus the UK. Control's always been a bit of a non-existing factor for the US anyway. But then on top of that, you've got, if you've defined control specifically and it's quite light touch, and a company goes beyond that, is there a risk in the EU system of finding yourself subject to overcompliance and sort of discrimination type activities? I'm just interested in what everyone thinks. And also, because it's under EU Regs 269, obviously I get that that's a reg, but it's a Russia specific reg, right, Mark? So therefore, does this apply to everything, and can we read it across that way, or will that still be up to the courts to then interpret for other regimes?
When you say apply to everything, do you mean other sanctions regimes?
Yeah, other sanctions regimes.
I suspect that slowly but surely this definition will find its way into the other regs. It would be a little odd, although not unprecedented, for that sort of definition to only be in the Russia regs. I haven't seen that it's gone over into the Belarus regs yet. I think at the moment it is just Russia. But I suspect it will. Well, I'm guessing, but it would be. It wouldn't surprise me if it was that slowly but surely inserted into all the other regs. I mean, you still do have the good faith compliance, Article 11 immunity. So if you're applying a definition of ownership and control that someone subsequently says was too strict, and you've unbanked someone, to use an ugly word, or blocked a transaction, you should still be able to rely upon the civil immunity under Article 11 in the regs. So long as you've documented your decision and all the rest of it, and there's no suggestion of, oh, let's screw the Russians or anything like that. But it is interesting, and it's not as ever with these sort of definitional changes to the regs. It's not entirely clear to me when they kick in. If you've got a case that's already before the courts, does the new definition now apply? Or is it only going to apply to new cases? I mean, it's just not something that the regulation has clarified. So yeah, it's added at least a bit of a temporary minefield, but I think it should. I think ultimately, even though it feels like a lessening by the EU and moving away from where the courts had come to, I think it should broadly be welcomed by compliance people to actually have a statutory definition of ownership and control that can be relied upon.
Yeah, I think I would add on that, when it comes to the future, right, it's policymakers, right, as Aleksi and I remember, right, as you remember, Ian, right, of like, you don't like just recreate everything in the future as though it's like in a vacuum. You start with what we had last. So this is just the latest move to define those definitions. So more than expect that this would be included in regs going forward, right? I think we should just assume that that will be the case, right? It was weird that we only had a real good definition in this guidance, and then there was more clarity in just Russia. So yeah, it's still weird, right? As Mark noted, that like we now have a definition only in this one reg, but it's not like there's new language. They didn't from the guidance, right? It's there. It's very similar, right? It's very broad at the same time. Having the ability to move assets is control. Having ability to, appoint most of the board members is control, right? So it's not like it's a completely nebulous benchmark for us, but yeah, I certainly expect that we're going to have this as our default going forward. And certainly that's where, the sanctions folks I talk to go into Brussels all the time. That's also their approach and thinking is, right. It's not just, oh, this is how far we got on Russia.
Yeah.
This is the new normal where we are on Russia. And then, right, we'll see how we want to apply that for the next, problem and challenge down the line.
No, definitely. It's just an interesting one to me because it's a bit like when they did aggregation, and it's how long does it take to go from we're doing it for Russia to then we're doing it for everybody else, and it's one of those things that it feels like it's, as you say, like it's not huge, but it does have a significant impact. So it's like let's kind of roll it out across everything.
To give an a UK example, Ian, the UK's general license for legal services was specific to Russia for 3 years. Then I think eventually they added Belarus, but it's only now have they extended it to all the other regimes, 3 years later. So, there are times when you get these oddities.
I'm not saying we're perfect. In fact, like that is one of the worst pieces of like legislation and licensing I've ever seen, to be quite honest, because they fundamentally made an issue of UK lawyers can't provide any compliance advice to anyone around the world, basically. And they went, oh, well, instead of actually rewriting the regulations, we're going to give a general license. But then we're going to give a general license and we're still going to get it wrong. And it's not going to take effect from day one of when we're not post-dating it because we can't do that with license.
I'm talking about the payment, the paying lawyers general license.
Right. Okay. Yes. Yeah.
Which was specific to Russia for about 2 years. Then they added Belarus, but only this month, I think, was it extended to all the other sanctions regimes.
Indeed. No, absolutely. So yeah, look, there's plenty of issues all around. I'm not saying that there aren't. I'm just intrigued because it kind of always feels like it feels like, and I want to be careful of being overly critical of former colleagues, etc. But it does feel like we're still always kind of on the back foot when these kind of announcements are being made, in terms of everything has to kind of scramble to catch up with things rather than being a bit more holistic. And I think that would be my advocation to government folk, but it's always going to be the problem, isn't it?
But I mean, there's a case before the Court of Justice at the moment on how you deal with offshore discretionary trusts in EU sanctions and ownership and control. And that's now, the legs have now been cut out from under that case, because now we've got a definition that ignores things like beneficial ownership and nominees, or let alone, rights under a discretionary trust as a beneficiary, let alone, someone who's got, settlor or protector or all those wonderful positions. That the EU's AML regs treats everyone who has any of those offices as a beneficial owner, but for purposes of sanctions, the CJEU was going to be telling us how it applied, and now the law's been changed. with seemingly paying 4 years later, seemingly ignoring the issue of trusts, which is a really odd one for me. But I think, broadly speaking, for a compliance person, it's helpful to have a statutory definition. There is clarity that comes from that.
Do you think by any chance this was an oversight and this will be updated, or do you think this was an intentional wording?
What, by oversight, 27 countries voted for this new definition? No, I don't think that was accidental at all. I think it was very much deliberate. It's just slightly odd from a policy perspective.
Right.
My question is, why is everybody so convinced that these particular instances of control, like hiding real true ownership and control behind a trust or some other made up structure, couldn't be captured by the new definition? For instance, the having de facto dominant influence. Are we so convinced that it is too narrow a definition? Because I'm not sure that I am.
No, I don't think so.
Yeah.
Well, it's the de facto, the power to de facto exercise the right suggests that there is a right, as opposed to just an informal understanding. The other provision refers to pursuant to an agreement entered into, which again isn't going to cover just an informal, the oligarchs resigned from the board, but he still is the person who makes all the decisions. The German case I mentioned from earlier this week, it was 9 directors who were designated, and the court said, okay, so the entity is controlled. But none of those directors had an ownership interest. They didn't have none of them had a right to appoint a director. So that case would probably fall outside.
But it speaks of a right to exercise dominant influence. So that and then the de facto being able to exercise. I agree that the formulation is not ideal in the right to exercise. But I would still say that it doesn't require for you to be able to have the right to appoint the majority of the directors. I would say that a person that is able to exercise dominant influence would be captured. That's how I would read it. But maybe I haven't spent as much time on it. I admit, Mark, that you for sure have. So I'm not trying to push too much.
Yeah.
Well, anyways, it's
yeah. Thank you for that question, Ian. It sparked a nice conversation.
Yeah, it was.
All right, I see we're at time, but I also see we have one question from the audience. So really quickly, if we could kind of cover that, it's from Samantha. She asked if what the panel's opinion on removal of sanctions can be seen as regulations or sanctions up for negotiation. So is it this? I guess, Samantha, is it basically trying to kind of state or ask, because it seems easy to remove sanctions? Or, I mean, would you like to clarify your question?
Was it removing of sanctions on a particular entity? So de-designating one entity.
Sorry, it's on a particular country, like the Balkans and Syria, and you go and have a nice conversation, and then there's softening of sanctions or removal. So is that now opening the door for more discussions from other countries, to go have those discussions and then potentially have a softening as well?
So I would say definitely, particularly when it comes to the U.S. point of view, right? Europe's more complicated. You got to get 27 folks to do things, to agree on policies, and right. But these days, when it comes to the U.S. government, it is very much apply sanctions to enemies, perceived or otherwise, and remove sanctions from friends, perceived or otherwise. the point of sanctions has always been to remove them by having the underlying reason for needing them change. This is what we used to always talk about, in the halls of Treasury and State, right? And, so that is the aim. The difference now is there's a much more capricious use of sanctions, right? Designating the president of Colombia is not a overarching policy goal there. It's pretty tenuous, the justification for it. And there's clear ulterior motives behind it, right? But those can be removed just as quickly. So, and one really good example, I think there was a deep dive on the U.S. approach towards the IMO negotiations on reducing shipping emissions, and the attempt at bullying and coercing of smaller states, particularly with the threat of applying sanctions, to get them to not support this global agreement on reducing shipping emissions. So you should see and expect there to be these kind of radical policy changes in the sanction space, because they're used to achieve aims that aren't directly related to the underlying point of the sanctions. There's a different policy motive behind it, and certainly in the U.S. context, there is the authority to do that and to apply sanctions in a very kind of knee-jerk manner. That hasn't been embraced in the past, but now it clearly is. So hopefully that answers your question. Happy to keep talking and nerding out about it as well.
No, thank you. I guess it's a bit of more fluidity, as you say, in the current regime. Yeah.
I mean, I think ultimately that's kind of the point of sanctions, right? Is to be fluid, to be able to respond to behavior
to a certain extent.
So that would be the hope, the aim, but it's just whether it truly translates into that and whether the behavior's actually changed. I might question in some of the cases that I've seen from the US. So I wouldn't read necessarily too much into it or read across too much. I'd still be a bit cautious, but yeah, that's definitely the aim, right?
It is interesting, like you've said, sanctions were made to be removed, but from my experiences, usually they're difficult to be removed, right? And does the underlying actions really change? Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes, even when people die, there's still sanctions, right? So there's still that kind of air of it's impossible to remove sanctions. But I think now, especially under the Trump administration, you're seeing some of that flexibility, that bending. But yeah, I mean, the whole point of sanctions is that you'll get the necessary action you want, and then it could be removed. But yeah, I think it varies in practice. Cool. Well, thank you very much for that question, Samantha. And yeah, I mean, we've covered a lot of ground today, so just want to quickly wrap up on a few kind of key takeaways. Sanctions are not slowing down, even though Ian pointed out that maybe in the UK they have been. If anything, they're getting more complex, more targeted, and more enforceable. Compliance isn't just a checkbox anymore. It's a strategic priority. And finally, the best way to stay ahead, stay curious, stay connected, and don't be afraid to ask questions, because the rules are changing fast and none of us have all the answers. And now, before we say goodbye, I want to remind everyone to connect with us on LinkedIn, follow us, and become a member, not only to stay updated on all of our events, podcasts, thought leadership pieces, etc., but also to be part of the conversation by sharing your insights and providing feedback in order for us to help rise up the community as best as we can. To our panelists, Ian, Mark, Tyler, and Aleksi, thank you again very much for sharing your expertise, your insights, and your time. You've given us a lot to think about, and I know I'm not the only one who's walking away with a clearer picture of what's next. And also, I'll be remiss not to say special congratulations to Tyler, who became a father recently, a few weeks ago. So congrats on that journey you now embark on. And to all those who are watching and listening, thank you for being here with us. This conversation doesn't end today. Keep the dialogue going. Reach out to our panelists if you have more questions. And like Tyler mentioned, if you want to nerd out on some more topics. And stay tuned for more updates from the Network for Financial Crime Prevention. Also, I put on a cap toward the end, so special thank you to Spectre for this cool cap that says compliance is in charge now. And last point, the US and the UK and some other countries around the world observed Memorial or Remembrance Day. Some call it Armistice Day. And that was, observed yesterday. So I just want to quickly thank you all who have served for your sacrifice. And until next time, stay compliant, stay informed, stay brave, and remember, we're all in this together. Thanks again, everyone. Happy Movember. Bye-bye, everyone.